So I mentioned entry criteria, good entry criteria. What's entry criteria?
So entry criteria is the term that we use to describe the stuff that we get given, like the information that we get given upfront. When we're doing a web test, a lot of the time that looks like URLs, usernames, passwords for authenticated users, looking at API definitions, documentation, postman collections, things like that. Anything that sort of gives us more information about the web application, how it's intended to work, and actually allows us to access the system.
Understood. So what makes for good versus not so good entry criteria?
I've seen both sides of the spectrum. Good entry criteria is well documented. It's clear APIs. All of them actually work. You know, the documentation, the credentials, they're all sort of functional. And then we have, credentials of varying privilege levels. We have clear scoped URLs. We know exactly what it is that we're testing and what exactly it is that we're not testing. A big part of gathering the entry criteria is also to determine exactly what is in scope and what is out of scope. If we have a series of URLs that are defined and the web application starts reaching out to third parties, then we can check that against our entry criteria and say, actually, this third-party URL is not in scope for us to test. Some of the best entry criteria we have ever received from a client was almost a year ago now, and they sent us Burp Suite testing files. So for those that don't know, Burp is a tool that we use to proxy web requests, and we got sent a OneDrive link full of videos, of requests and responses from every single API, fully documented web application functionality, everything. It made me a little bit emotional, actually. It was incredible. On the flip side of things, you get sort of API collections that have been exported from internal developers, and a lot of the time things like environment variables are wrong, or the host URLs are pointed to localhost and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a pretty wild spectrum.
Understood. So if we were to look at assumed breach testing as a whole, what are the insights that you would get from that type of testing?
There's quite a lot. When you look at the value of assumed breach testing, usually it takes a little bit longer, tends to be a little bit more expensive because of the fact that it takes longer, but you generally find a lot more valuable findings. You get a lot more valuable issues out of it because it actually allows you to test things like functionality that a standard user would be able to use. You get to test things like administrator functionality that no sort of externally facing unauthenticated attacker would ever be able to see. You can look for things like privilege escalation. You can look for things like access control and authorization vulnerabilities. A very common one from a authenticated user perspective is an authorization vulnerability called insecure direct object reference, or IDOR, which is basically, if you imagine an application that is a sales portal, and on checkout you get given your cart is ID number 1, and then you change the ID in the URL to ID number 2, and all of a sudden you have somebody else's cart details and their user information that they've submitted. That's not the kind of thing that you would really see if you weren't given access to that application upfront.
Okay, understood. Well, as always, we're happy to talk about specific environments and how that might be able to provide more value by performing assumed breach testing.